Okay, folks, can you hear me? No. Okay, so let's start with the big news of the week, right? Which is, what's everybody talking about? Is it a corporate finance story? Now tell me the corporate finance story. What did now there's all the technology story. What has DeepSeek done that affects business, revenues, profits? Go ahead.
We created the large language model, which performs comparably with OpenAI, but at a much lower cost structure, which raises the question of is American investment emphasizing capital flow.
Let's keep the national issue up. You wake up in NVIDIA on Monday, is your story different? Right? I mean, because until last Friday, the story was, if you want to create an AI product or service, what do you need to do? Invest in incredibly expensive data centers with very expensive NVIDIA chips and have access to immense amounts of data, right? That was the prevailing wisdom. And it pushed up NVIDIA, it pushed up companies like Constellation Energy. You're saying, why? Because data centers require immense amounts of power. Let's talk of taking nuclear power plants out of mothballs and making them, so these data centers incredibly power hungry. And you have a whole ecosystem. There are companies that provide gas to these power centers and cool. So there's a whole array. What's the essence of disruption? You look at something being done and everybody tells you, this is the way it has to be done. You say, what if I could do it differently and cheaper? And that is at the core of the DeepSeek story. There's a lot of stuff we don't know. I mean, let's rule out the things we know are just PR. Did it cost only 6.3 million to develop DeepSeek? Of course not. It probably cost hundreds of millions, perhaps even a billion. They probably used some NVIDIA chips along the way to help them out. So it's not as if this was created by three people in a hut on the top of the Himalayas with no access to anything. It was clear. But even if it cost $1 billion, that's a lot less than what Meta alone spent, what, 65 billion on it. But for some reason, VCs seem to think that it's not enough to be impressive. You've got to be super impressive. So there's this part of the story of it only cost 6 million. It didn't cost her. But it is, I think the most impressive part is that 2 years ago, at the height of, or a year ago, at the height of AI's hype, where everybody had bought into it, right? Not just investors, but all of the tech titans said, this is the way to do it. Somebody sitting in a room in China said, why? That's how disruption always starts. Why? In my valuation class, I'm going to value NVIDIA. I'm going to go do a valuation as of Friday because I've been valuing NVIDIA multiple times, and I'm going to value it on Monday. Could the value be different? Of course. It's a corporate finance story that's going to roll through the next 15 weeks and beyond. And for some of you who pick a company in that space, and I'm going to talk about your project, it is going to be very much part of what you will have to deal with when you talk about thinking about the right corporate finance actions for your company. I told you everything is corporate finance. So today, here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to start by kind of mopping up the parts of the syllabus I didn't get to, especially that unpleasant part where you actually have to get a grade. I could lie and say it's all about the learning. I'd like to think that, but let's face it, you want a grade, you want that grade to be a decent grade, so I'll lay the foundations. But if you remember last class, I described this class as a big picture class, but I also said it was an applied class. So what does that mean? I want you to be able, when you come out of this class, to be actually do things with the corporate finance tools, not just talk about them, not just hire McKinsey to do them, but do them yourself. So everything in this class, I'm going to apply in real companies, often in real time. I've never used a case study in 40 years of teaching. And I think I don't want to pass aspersions on other people using case studies, but I think it's a little silly in my class when you've got 48,000 live case studies out there to go talk about a company and something that happened to it in 1988 written by a Harvard Business School professor who knows the ending to the story and acts like he or she doesn't know it so that they can look really good in class because they can lead the discussion to, obviously, Time Warner should not have bought AOL. Really? You need a case study to show me this? The problem with live case studies is they're out of your control. And I think that's exciting that you create a case study and you don't know what the next thing is. It's like going to a movie, not one of those rom-coms. So you know what the ending is, right? In the first 3 minutes, the first 5. A movie where you don't know what's coming. So everything in this class, I'm going to apply on real companies because the class has to have a structure. I'm going to set them back in 2013, but I'm going to talk about these companies today. First company I'm going to use in this class, and I'm going to use it. Remember the investment decision, the financing decision, the dividend decision? Is Disney. Why did I pick Disney? Because everybody kind of knows what Disney does, right? If I picked Alcoa, you'd be struggling for the next 15 years. Tell me again what Alcoa does. Or Cisco, what does Cisco do? Disney, you kind of know, right? Everybody's seen Mickey Mouse and the theme parks and the movies and the Avenger movies. So it's a large US entertainment company, and everything I do in this class, I'm going to apply on Disney. So I'm going to come up with a hurdle rate, come up with an investment for Disney that I'm going to make up. A Disney theme park, how would you assess it? What's the right financing mix for Disney? How much should Disney pay in dividends? And tie it all up with how does this play out in Disney's value? The second company I'm going to use is a company called Vale. Anybody know what Vale does? It's an iron ore mining company in Brazil. It's the largest iron ore mining company. You're saying, why did you pick Vale to be as different from Disney as I could get, right? Old economy, new economy, emerging market, developed market. And to put a icing on the cake here, Vale used to be a government-owned company that's now a publicly traded company, but the Brazilian government maintains what's called a golden share, or the equivalent of veto power over big decisions. I want to talk about how corporate finance decisions within Vale are going to be affected by all of those parameters. The third company I'm going to use is a company called Tata Motors. What does Tata Motors do? Obviously, it makes cars. What kind of cars? It used to be mass market automobiles. It's been around in India for a long time. Until in 2009, Tata Motors did a facelift, a change, which is it acquired, anybody know who it acquired? Jaguar Land Rover, a global luxury auto company. But the bigger story, it's part of a family group, which is not uncommon in Asia and Latin America. Many companies are parts of family groups. You're saying, so what? In corporate finance, we look at investment financing and dividend decisions as if the managers of the company cared just about the company. But if you're a company that's part of a family group, there's somebody above you. In fact, with the Tata Group, this is actually very physical. They're in one building in Mumbai called Mumbai House, and each floor is top executives of each company. And the very top floor used to sit Ratan Tata, the family patriarch. Do you think anything big happens in the lower floors without it at least being passed by the top floor? If you do, you're being incredibly naive. And here's what it creates. It creates decisions that companies can make that sometimes are not in the best interest of the company. So why are they doing it? But actually work in the best interest of the group. So I want to talk about that conflict. What happens when companies are part of a family group and they have to think about what's good for the group as opposed to the fourth company I'm going to use is Baidu. Have any of you used Baidu? Come on, if you're from China, you have to have used Baidu, but Baidu is a search engine. You're saying, why haven't I heard of it? For a good reason. It's not a very good search engine. But it dominates in China. I still remember my first trip to China. I was flying the long flight to Shanghai. I'm working on a blog post. I have Google blog. I'm very old fashioned, so it's not been updated. So it's a very old fashioned. So I land in Shanghai. I open up my Google blog and it's not there. So what the heck happened? I type in google.com and nothing comes up. So the $2 billion company disappeared while I was in the air. It turns out that the Google search box is not technically accessible. You can get through it by going through a VPN or double VPNs, which I have no patience for. Baidu is a Chinese search engine. It's a technology company. It's a very successful Chinese technology company because there are a lot of Chinese. It's a big market. Why did I pick Baidu? Because I wanted to pick a Chinese company and I wanted to pick a technology company. This allowed me to do both. I was running out of time for more companies, so got both of them. The fifth company I'm going to use is Deutsche Bank. Why? First, because I like horror stories. And Deutsche Bank reminds me of that teenager in every horror story. The one I'm talking about, you come to an empty house, it's dark, and the teenager opens the front door and goes in. He's saying, "What are you doing?" And she keeps going, and it's usually a she. It's very sexist. And they get to the entry to the basement. There's a basement door, and you can hear the sound of a chainsaw coming from the basement. Come on. You walk into a dark house, there's a chainsaw sound coming from the basement. What's any rational person going to do? You're going to run out of that house as quickly as you can. But that's not what this teenager does. She opens the door, she walks down to the basement, and the rest, as they say, is blood, gore, and history. Deutsche Bank does that every single year, right? The basement is another crisis. This time I've learned my lesson. I'll never go into the basement again. Next year, they repeat the process. So it's good to take a horror story and say, how did they get to be a horror story? But along the way, I also want to talk about how is corporate finance different if you're a regulated company. Banks have the most regulations on what they can or cannot do. For instance, we talked about debt to equity and whether what you can do. But the bank, that financing mix question might be out of your hands. Regulators decide how much you can use. And the final company I'm going to use is not even a company. It's a bookstore in New York that I've changed the name on called Bookscape. Privately owned, small bookstore. Why did I pick it? Because I want to take every corporate finance decision today. If you're the owner of a small business, a plumbing business, an electrician, how do you navigate those big questions? So as we go through this class, you're going to see me come back to these companies, and by the 15th week, you're going to be as familiar with these companies as I am, because they're going to be the standards as we go through. As we go through this process, the question, of course, going to be thinking about is, what will the grade look like? I'll give away the game. This is a finance class. We're all covered by pretty much the same distribution. It's supposed to apply to all the other departments, but don't control them. So maybe you get 90% A's in the strategy class. That's not going to happen here. It's 30, 35% A's, about 50, 55% B's. And there will be C's and D's. For some reason, people think that those letters of the alphabet have disappeared from the grading system. They're still there, but you really have to try to get there. How am I going to decide? Well, I have subjectively, if you get it, and I'll decide you've got it, it's A or A minus. You almost get it, it's a B. If you're trying to get it, it's not catching. If you don't even know what it is, and then clearly the D's and the F's are, what are we talking about for 15 weeks? Hopefully you will not end up in that last slice. I don't like to put people there because then I've got to deal with the number of people who end up in that space. So I'm going to try as hard as I can to keep you on the right side of this divide. But here's what your grade is going to be based on. There will be a case, and I have to change the due date on this because for some reason our spring break is a week later than it was, and that happens to be spring break week. I am not sadistic enough to say your project is due in the middle of spring break. So I will change that date probably to the next week. What is the case going to be? I don't know. I haven't written it yet. I concoct a case. Maybe DeepSeek will be a good thing to build a case around, but leave that to me. So somewhere in about 2 or 3 weeks, you will get a case. You'll work on it as a group. You're saying, what group? Start thinking about forming a group of people. I won't put you in a group. Right? So you're saying, what if I can't find a group? Until last year, I used to create an orphan list where you could put your name on and you could get adopted. But then somebody last year told me that this was very inconsiderate and that was hurting their feelings. So I will call it something else. Let's call it corporate finance limbo. Isn't that the place in the Catholic where you end up in this middle space? You're not sure where you are. Right? Right? Is it limbo? Limbo might be the dance, but whatever it is, we'll call it something so you can go put your names in there and you will get either adopted or better still, you can get other people just like you and create a list of people in limbo. But you have to find a group, the case will be, and you write a case report, be obvious, I will state the obvious, it'll be one report for the whole group, and there'll be one grade for the whole group. That's somewhere in the middle of the semester. The other project is a project where we're going to pick a company. So I want you to start thinking about a company. And you're going to work on that company through the class as a group. Each of you in the group has to pick a company. I would like that company to have a common theme, partly so that you don't have to start. So let's take a theme. You could take semiconductors. What's going to be in that group? You could have NVIDIA in that group. You could, take Intel, the two ends of the life cycle here, right? One is, of course, this company that could do nothing wrong until last Friday. And the other company that seems to be able to do nothing right now. It's good to have divergence. That's what you're looking for. You might throw companies that feed into the semiconductor space. They don't all have to be, but what you're looking for are companies that are different. So if you're doing retail, you might pick Amazon, but pick Mercado Libre, which is a Latin American online retail company. Pick Walmart, a traditional physical retail company. Throw in a Target if you want to, or a small retailer if you want to, niche retailer. But you're looking for something in common. But each of you will work on your company, saying, what's the group structure going to do? I want you to talk about what you find about your company that's different from what other people find, then ask why. So if you find that your company takes on a lot of debt and another company supposedly same space, you're a hospital, your group is hospitality. And 4 of you picked hotels, and the 5th picked Travelocity, and the 6th picked Airbnb. I can almost guarantee you before you start that Airbnb's corporate finance decisions are going to be very different than Marriott's decisions. And the class is not just about chronicling numbers. In fact, I have a spreadsheet right now that'll do all the numbers for you. You don't need an AI. I could actually make it an AI. This is about you reading the numbers and creating a narrative. So if you haven't thought about it already, start thinking about a group. Obviously, you got to get your group on. I define theme very broadly. I mean, last semester, one group picked Vice. They did gambling, tobacco, cannabis. They picked a Canadian cannabis stock. They had a lot of fun. A casino in there. I mean, basically, you can define your theme and pick a theme that you're interested in. Don't ask what will be easy. Ask yourself what will be interesting. Okay, because I guarantee, no matter what company you pick, there are two types of companies I'd like you to avoid. One is money-losing companies, young money-losing companies, and I'll tell you why. Corporate finance becomes far too simple. And here's what. If you're a young money-losing company, how much money can you borrow? Don't think too long. If you're in a hole, stop digging, right? How much can you pay out in dividends? So you're going to be, after you get through the investment section, you're saying, what do I do next? My optimal debt ratio is 0 and I can't pay dividends, and you're going to come and complain to me and say, I told you not to pick a money-losing company. So pick a money-making company and avoid banks unless you really want to spend your life following banks. Why? Because banks are regulated. You have to understand, what the difference is between tier 1 capital and tier 2 capital. And if you don't want to spend your life learning that minutia because it's not interesting to you, it's not the place you want to be. So if you're a group and you really want to do banks or insurance companies because you're all kind of strange financial service company people, come and talk to me. I'll be willing to help. But in general, stay away from it. There will be 3 quizzes for this class. The dates are specified. There will be, unfortunately, given the size of this class, I have zero flexibility in terms of moving the quiz. I can't give it earlier, I can't give it later. Why? Because the quiz will leak, right? I have to write a fresh quiz, and I am lazy, and it creates all kinds of logistical challenges. But I do understand that life gets in the way, that you might not be able to make a quiz. Why? Because you have an interview. I understand you came for an MBA to get a job. And I understand that has to take, and if you do miss a quiz, you don't lose the 10%, it gets moved to what's left in the class. So if you miss the first quiz, which is the 10% quiz, your second and third quiz will be worth 12% apiece, your final will be worth 36%. If you miss the second quiz, then your third quiz will get bumped up to 15. So basically, it'll always go forward. Why? Because otherwise you'll get strategic quiz missing, right? You know what I mean by that? You do really well in the first two quizzes, you miss the third quiz, because it actually weights your first two quizzes more. I've been teaching 40 years, no game. I don't want you to game the system. So basically, but you will not. The one advantage of taking all three quizzes, and I got to throw a little sweetener in there. Otherwise, you're saying, why didn't I just miss one of the three? Is in addition to learning all the material as it happens, because that's what you have to do for the quizzes. I will take your worst quiz and replace the score in your worst quiz with the scores on your other two quizzes. So let's take an extreme example. You get a 10 on quiz 1, you get a 0 on quiz 2. Why? Bad things happen to you that day. In third quiz, you're back to 10. I will take the 0 and replace with the 10. Right? Actually, it'll be the average across the two quizzes and the final exam, but you get the picture, right? Basically, I will take your worst quiz and give you the quiz on the average grade on the rest of your exams. There is a final exam date. As I said, I'll put it up, it's, I think, the week after. But we'll have to, we'll talk about it, because if you have to leave early, you might have to have issues. So we'll talk about if you have issues in timing, we'll deal with that as well. You can go through this page when you get a chance, but it gives you good reasons for missing a quiz. Like what? I'll give you a bad reason. I don't feel ready. So here's my suggestion. If you're really not ready and that's your reason, at least do me the service of coming up with a reason that sounds good. Right. I'll let you, I'm not going to ask you for a doctor's note. I'm going to trust you. We're adults here, but adults lie to each other all the time. So I don't even know why we say we're adults here, as if that leads to truthfulness. No. So if you want to miss a quiz, I won't stop you. But remember, if you do miss a quiz, you lose that best of the three, the worst of the three quiz option. And you also miss learning for that quiz, which you will need, because the final exam is always a comprehensive final. It is open book, open notes, and open devices. And the reason for that is, how many of you have your lecture notes on an iPad or a computer? Pretty much everybody, right? Who prints off stuff? So given that it's open book, open notes, if I don't let you open your devices, that kind of defeats the open notes. But you cannot use Excel on your laptop, partly because you don't need it. The problems are written in such a way that you can do the numbers by hand, and partly because you have 200 people trying to work with Excel in a room. Bad things happen, right? Computers break down, there's noises of beeping. So basically, you can use devices, you can do notes, you can do whatever you want. You can summarize it, whatever works for your learning, you can bring it in. This is not about checking whether you remember an equation. It's about checking whether you remember there was an equation and where to find it in your notes, right? Because which requires that you actually go through the notes before you. And as I said, every exam I've ever given in this class, I think my very first exam is 1986, is online. And the solutions obviously are online as well. That's what the review sessions will cover. The TAs will go through those. On the group work, as I said, pick your own group and police it yourself. And again, this is where the your adults part of it comes in. But I said the same thing to my undergraduates who are 21 years old. Figure out what I mean by police it is, there's always this one person in the group, you know, the one I'm talking about, who never seems to keep up. 14th week, they still haven't picked a company. And remember, this is a group project your grade drives on, saying, what do I do? Watch The Godfather. There's some good suggestions on how to get people to do things. Okay. Get your message across. Don't make me the messenger, right? I mean, I would be fired if I chopped off somebody's pet's head and put it on the, that's what I saw in The Godfather. But figure out a way to keep them in line. Okay? That's about it for the class. As for class participation, there are no rules. Other than don't start yelling at each other across the room. Anything is fair game. So if you want, the problem with the class this big is you feel intimidated to ask questions when you start. Hopefully that'll fade. You'll be more willing to jump in. So please do jump in, contest something I say if you think it's, that you have a different view. I'm not going to be in the least bit insulted because you did that. It'll actually make it more fun. The more you talk, the less I have to talk, which means it makes my job easier. Okay. Yeah, there's somebody already jumping in.
Yeah, so the submission of the case on March 26th, that's during spring break.
Were you here? So remember I said yesterday about physically being here, but mentally you might be gone? Have you been here right from the beginning of the class? Ask your neighbor what I just said about when the case is due. Okay, so now we'll let that pass, right? So in a sense, it can happen. It's a perfect example for why everything is recorded and online, is because these moments will happen. So don't take it personally. It does happen. It's okay. So no. So let's turn to the first lecture note packet, because now we're going to start the process. So. This packet is about 300 and something pages. So we're going to roll. This is going to take you through the 15 session. So if you got this packet, this 15 session, make sure you download the second packet because it'll take you through the rest of the class. Today, I want to focus on something we don't talk about enough in any of our classes, which is, it's a business school, right? So all these classes, and here's a core question: what is the end game when you run a business? If you ask Milton Friedman that question, what would he have told you? If you get a chance, go and read Milton Friedman's 1971 piece. It's an opinion piece in the New York Times. What would Milton Friedman say your end game is as a business? Well, he basically said you create a product or service that people need, that they will pay you for. You make money on it, and it's not just profits this year, but profits in the long term. You run businesses to make money. That's so mercenary, I know, but that's the end game. And of course, you get pushback on that, which is businesses have bigger objectives, more purposes. And in fact, much of the pushback has been around for as long as time. You know how Adam Smith described economics, right? Anybody know what his description of economics was? Adam Smith, of course, father of free market.
A lot of stuff for like the invisible hand.
The invisible hand is a good way. It's a gospel of mammon, is how he described it. If you have no idea what mammon is, go look it up on Google. It's not a good description. Basically, that you do things that could be essentially the line between good and evil, that you might walk very close to it. But the essence of a business is you're a business, but pushback has been around as long as business has been around. And in the last 20 years, this pushback has kind of acquired this special power behind it, partly because Harvard Business School threw its lot in there, and they're always the first movers here. And Harvard Business School exists for one reason and one reason alone: to make consulting firms a lot of money, because they create an acronym, consulting firms run with it. And of course, there are three forms this pushback has taken. The first is sustainability. I'm sure some of you have classes with the word sustainability in it. Some of you might have had titles at the works you had sustainability. It's a big word out there. But the idea is you want to put sustainability, presumably of the planet, but I'm going to come back and push back of sustainable what? Because sustainability people just say sustainability. It predates business, right? Planet sustainability is something that environmentalists have fought for, Greenpeace, for instance, going back a century. But this is corporate sustainability, and we've got to ask, what are we sustaining? The second is this notion of stakeholder wealth. Who's a stakeholder? Pretty much everybody, right? Your customers are stakeholders, your employees are stakeholders, the bankers are stakeholders, society is a stakeholder. That maybe this shareholder thing is too narrow, that we need to think about all stakeholders. And the third, of course, is that acronym, ESG. And I'll give you my priors. When I'm asked what I think about ESG, I said it was born in sanctimony, nurtured with hypocrisy, and sold with sophistry. There's nothing good I can say about this acronym. But we'll come back and talk about why, because it sounds good, right? You're saying, what is wrong with caring about the environment, caring about society, and caring about governance? My response is, if you truly care about these things, the last thing you should be doing is putting your trust in ESG. So let's start with this notion of stakeholders. Who are the stakeholders in a company? Obviously, shareholders are stakeholders. Why? Because they supply the equity capital. Lenders are stakeholders because they lend money to a firm. Employees are stakeholders because they get the wages from the company. Customers are stakeholders because they have interactions with the company, products and services. Society is a stakeholder in the form of a government because the government collects taxes from the company and might pass rules and regulations and laws that the company has to operate under. Even your competition is a stakeholder. The only problem is they're a stakeholder with a very different interest, and they want you to go down. But everybody has a stake in the company. And in corporate finance, we elevate one of these stakeholders to the top of the pyramid. And who do we put at the top of the pyramid? And that is where the disagreement starts. Why would you, it looks like we're playing favorites, right? So does somebody want to tell me why shareholders get this special place where they get to pick the management, they get to run the firm? What is it about their relationship with the company that makes us put them on top of the pyramid? Do you think a lender lending to a risky company is not carrying? If it were a risk, employees who might lose their job. I mean, you could argue that the employee risk is actually much more tangible than an investor who has 50 other companies in their portfolio. Risk alone can't explain it. Yeah. They just own the firm. So owners get to do whatever they want. That sounds like, if you have the power, you should be able to carry it through. That's a very brutal reason for it. Okay, let's get close. I think we're getting closer to the truth. Lenders lend money to the firm, right? But when you lend money, whether you're a banker or a bondholder, what do? You get a contract that protects you. Yeah.
Their incentives are directly aligned to the financial.
I think that's what's going to come out of the contractual relationship. I mean, the alignment issue comes about because we put shareholders on top. It's almost an output. The question is, why do we create that input? Lenders lend money to a firm. They have a contract. And in the contract, what do? They set the interest rate based on how much risk they see in you. They write covenants on what you cannot do. Sometimes they screw up, but they have a contract. Employees have a contract. Now we can debate whether those contracts have become too weak because of the, because of the weakening of labor unions, but there's a contract, right? There's a wage. You might say, I don't like the wage. You quit and go work for somebody else. You have benefits. Basically, you get a contract. Do customers have a contract? Yeah, you buy a product or service and it doesn't do what you thought. I mean, you might have a tough time returning it. It wasn't from Amazon, but you can return it. You can demand your money back. And if they don't do it, you can, if you're willing to spend the time and the resources, you can there's a contract. Every customer purchase is an implicit contract. Does the government have a contract with a company? Right? You can think about this whole process as a contract, right? You pay taxes, in return, the government provides protection on your patents. So basically, again, we can argue whether those contracts have been weakened and exploited, but there's a contract. And even competition has its own contract, right? Especially in the US with antitrust laws, you can go. The only group that does not have a contractual relationship is shareholders. What do they get? They get whatever's left over. Let's be real. Let's suppose you invest and I tell you, you get whatever's left over. And I say, go away now. I'm going to let the other people run this business. How much are you going to get left over? Nothing. You know why universities never run a surplus? They always run at a deficit. Because there is no risk. They basically take the pie and say, who's getting what slice of the pie? And then they run out of the pie and they go borrow more pies. The reason we put shareholders up, it's not because we like shareholders, that they're preferred. It's because they have a residual claim. And if you don't let them run the company, in the long term, nobody will take that residual claim. So in practice, it is true, we put shareholders on top. And then we go through this exercise where we start to narrow how we think about that objective. Traditional corporate finance, the objective is to maximize the value of the entire business. And then we ask managers, go out and do it. But here's the problem. Managers, and somebody brought this up, are accountable to one. Remember, the capital for a business comes from both lenders and shareholders. Managers in most companies tend to be accountable to which of those two groups? Unless you're in distress, the lenders really don't run the manager account. So in practice, instead of maximizing firm value, managers focus on maximizing shareholder wealth, the portion of the capital that comes from equity. So we've already narrowed the objective. The problem with shareholders' wealth is who's going to estimate it? You could call in McKinsey every year to do it. First, you got to pay that hefty fee. Second, it's subjective. So if you're a publicly traded firm, that objective gets narrowed even further. In a publicly traded firm, there is an observable number for the shareholder wealth, right? Which is the market price. So in practice, when people talk about corporate finance, they say the objective in corporate finance is to maximize stock prices, right? And it's really not, but you get there because pragmatically, if you run a publicly traded company as a manager, you end up focusing on maximizing stock prices. And I'll make a confession, that's terrifying. Because we know that that's built on the presumption that the markets get this at least reasonably right? So I'm going to start with this maximizing stock price, which is a narrow version of maximizing the value of the firm, talk about why we've picked it as an objective in corporate finance, what can go wrong, and horrible things can happen at companies when you try to maximize stock prices, and then talk about what do we do instead. So there I'll bring in every possible alternative, including sustainability, ESG, and we'll pass them through the test of, hey, will this work better than maximizing stock prices? So let's start with what I think is common sense. When you run an organization, you can have only one objective. You can't have 5 objectives. You can have one objective and multiple constraints. You're saying, why can't I do all of these things? Because you will have to make choices. Saying, I want to maximize revenue growth and margins and value. Hey, you know what? I would like to do all of those things as well. But if you run a business, sometimes you have to decide which one you want to put on top. So you have to decide, tell me what your central objective is, and I'll let you have constraints. Now, of course, no, you can disagree with the central objective I picked, but don't tell me you want 5 objectives. That's why I don't like company mission statements that have 7 different things they claim to do. Come on, guys, make up your mind. What are you really trying to do? What are your constraints? Objective and constraints. And if the company is traded, focusing on stock prices comes with a bonus, right? What's the bonus? It's updated constantly. So on Monday morning this week, what happened to NVIDIA's stock price? It dropped 16%. Let's make it real. That's $580 billion. NVIDIA lost more in market cap on Monday at opening than the entire African equity markets put together. The dollar values are staggering. Why? Because market said the game has changed. You know how long it's going to take accountants to come to that recognition? Probably 2.5 years. It'll eventually percolate its way through. Markets, you get instantaneous results. And if investors are rational, and that's a big if, then that adjustment reflects what the loss or gain in value is. So that's the nice thing about stock prices. You don't have to wait around to say, did I do the right thing? You get instantaneous feedback. And people don't like this objective. Okay? So when you look at this objective, they always go back to the worst case scenario. And this is, to me, the straw man version of corporate finance, that if you let corporate finance play out, we're going to have what I call the original corporatism, which is 19th century, Rockefellers and Carnegies. Essentially, their end game was they would maximize stock prices and the rest of the world be damned. My son's fiance's sister's husband is a Rockefeller. He's a real Rockefeller, not the John D. Rockefeller. He'd be 150 years old. He's a very nice guy, but I was terrified when I first met him because I had visions of John D. Rockefeller coming through. And I'm sure that John D. Rockefeller was not a particularly fun person to hang out with. I know Andrew Carnegie did amazing things. Every library in the East Coast came out of a Carnegie. But Andrew Carnegie was ruthless. So the straw man is, if you maximize stock prices, we're all going to be back at the end of the 18th century, and you're going to have, and there are people who play that out, right? Look at the tech giants. They're going to be, we'll come back and talk about why this is not a repeat of the end of the 18th century, but that's your, and there, what do the people running the company do? They really exploit every single other stakeholder. Starting with lenders, right? They have the power to actually get rates at rates below what they should be paying. Employees in the late 1800s had zero protection. You could work 16 hours in a mine, probably didn't have any health benefits, you died, there was nothing that you did. Customers, remember I talked about contesting the company if you don't like what you get? Forget about that when you're dealing with US Steel and it's your only company around making steel. You take it or leave it. You think, what about governments? These were so big that governments did what they wanted them to do rather than the other way around. They wrote the regulations. What about the competition? What competition? The original idea of creating a trust was to eliminate competition. So if this is the world we're going to end up in, I don't want it either. So as I listen to critiques of companies focused on stock prices, I hear three broad themes come through. And if you're in the outside, I would fault you for believing that these themes are what drive. The first is that if you maximize stock prices, you can't take care of your employees. That the companies that maximize stock prices, care about their financial health, must be doing it at the expense of employees. And let's face it, every day you wake up, at least in one news story, but this seems to play out, right? And how does it play out? Verizon lays off 20,000 employees. And you keep reading the story, the stock price went up 3%. And in your mind, you're making a connection. Laying off employees must mean stock prices go up. So if you care about maximizing profits and value and stock prices, it must come at the expense of employees. Of course, that's going to be true in individual cases, but let's talk about in general, is that true? Would you rather have worked at Tesla over the last decade or GM at the last decade? This is a no-brainer, right? Would you rather work at Amazon or Walmart? Much as we like to complain about Amazon workers are happier at Amazon than Walmart. You say, how do you know? I didn't interview all of them. I went to Glassdoor. If you heard of Glassdoor, you can actually go see what companies engaged at. And once I was there, it was fascinating. I want to say, what the happiest places in America to work with? Are these the places that don't care about profits? Well, I pulled up the list and I'm going to show it to you, and you can make your own judgments on This is not in your notes because I just pulled it up this morning. These are the happiest places to work at least according to Glassdoor. Bain and Company, why? Because you're probably being paid a ton of money, you have an expense account, and you have Crew Car Wash. I don't know, I want to drive through Crew. I mean, it's In-N-Out Burger. I do go to In-N-Out Burger in California. People are very happy. Maybe they get to eat unlimited burgers and fries. There's, of course, NVIDIA, not Intel. Notice? Right? The Church of Jesus Day, that tells you also that employees are not made happy just by paying them a higher amount, that there's a cultural issue which can keep, something that investment banks started forgetting in the 1980s. Right? Because when I started in the 1980s, when you walked into an investment bank, you actually could tell where you were without looking at the name at the top, because Solomon is full of these scruffy traders. None of them, even if they wear a tie, the tie was never knotted all the way. It's pulled down and a shirt was pulled off. And you walked into Morgan Stanley, the tie is all tied up. Everybody's wearing the same suit. It's almost like they went to the same store, probably Barney's, and they bought the suit. There was a cultural connection. The advantage of that is people then self-select to be there, even if they don't get, even if they get paid less, because they like the culture. And somewhere in the 1980s, investment banks thought they should compete on one dimension. And you know exactly what that dimension is because you had interaction with them, either in the interviews, which is, we'll pay you more. And I caution them. I said, if you play this game, you know where it's going to end up, right? If that's the dimension, then people are going to come to you because you pay the most. But then if D.E. Shaw pays even more, they're going to leave you and go to D.E. Shaw because you created the game. There's zero loyalty left in the system precisely because you took it out. So I'm glad you got the Mormon church up there, right? That's the Church of Latter-day Saints, because it kind of brings home that fact that employee satisfaction, you're saying, doesn't that show you should maximize? No, it basically says that if you look at employee satisfaction, it has very little to do with you saying the right things to the rest of the world, but treating people right and doing well as an institution. And the Mormon church is financially the healthiest church out there. The Catholic Church is also wealthy, but it's all in the Vatican basement and stuff, so it doesn't have the cash inflow. It's got a cash flow problem right now. So don't lose any sleep over it. They'll fix it somehow. The worst places to work were? Oh, top is DHL Express. Second is United. And I can attest to this because I have frequent interactions with United. It's my airline of choice, partly because it's the only airline that flies enough flights to San Diego that I can be on it. But as you go down this list, there aren't too many healthy companies on this list, right? Is there even a Radio Shack around? I don't know what they must have found. The last employee at Radio Shack who works at this legacy store said, what do you think about it? And even that guy doesn't like Radio Shack. I'll wager that if you walk into a department store anywhere, you're not going to be surrounded by happy people. That these are people clearly there because they get a paycheck and they're not particularly satisfied. So let's put this mythology to the side that ultimately, if you really want to take care of your employees, you got to start by doing financially well, right? Second, you're told that if you want to maximize stock price, it must mean you don't care about your customers. I still remember about 30 years ago, I did a session for the Gap. It was part of a top management group. This wasn't the Gap, was actually a successful retail store. They kept opening new. They had just opened Banana Republic and Old Navy. So they had a lot of money. And the way you could tell is they had this management meeting in Sundance. And even in Sundance, this is this Robert Redford ran. So it's in a hotel room probably costs $1,000 a night. So they bring in people from different disciplines to talk to the top management. I had the singular misfortune of following the marketing guru to the podium. Because just before he left, so the objective of the Gap should be to maximize customer satisfaction. And he left. I wish he'd stayed. Because I got up to the podium and said, this is the stupidest objective I've ever heard. How many of you have actually shopped at the Gap? See how few hands go up? Already you can see why they're in trouble. Think about your collective experience shopping there and think about what makes you satisfied. You walk in. It's nice if the store is well lit and it's got. So you walk in through and then you find the khakis you want. Is that all Gap sells? I mean, pretty much it, right? In the size you want, in the color you want. They actually make khakis and colors other than khakis, so don't ask me why. You're feeling pretty satisfied, right? And then you get ready to leave and there's a scrimp on your satisfaction, which is you got to stop at the damn cash register to pay for your khakis. So if you took the marketing guru's objective to heart, what should you do? Take the cash registers out. Your customers will be incredibly satisfied for a couple of weeks and then you go bankrupt. You think that is so absurd. Customer satisfaction matters. But why does it matter? Because you want them to come back and I shop at Costco. You know what the great thing about Costco is? You can buy stuff and return it. There are people who bring in 2-year-old refrigerators. And say, I didn't like this refrigerator. Costco will take it back, but they'll also take your membership away. So that's the cost, right? Costco keeps its customers satisfied, and I like them for it, but they do it because they want you to get a Costco membership and keep. So I agree. You want customers to be satisfied, but let's be very clear. You want customers to be satisfied because you want them to come back to you, to sell them stuff. You could make customers satisfied by selling stuff below cost, but how long will you survive as a business by doing it? And there's a final canard about stock price maximization, which is if you maximize stock prices, you must be some kind of moral troglodyte. That's how I described myself when I wrote first about ESG. I said, you're going to think I'm a moral troglodyte, but I'm okay with that. I'll give you how the rest of the world views corporate finance. And you're going to see this happen when you show up at Thanksgiving this year. At whatever family Thanksgiving you're in. You're going to tell them that you're in an MBA program and people are already going to start to bring you down the morality scale. Then you say, I'm going to go work for a hedge fund, and now you're really scraping the bottom. You say, I work in corporate finance, and you're done. Because here's the vision of corporate finance that the rest of the world has. I'm going to give you an assignment for this weekend. I want you to watch this movie called Other People's Money. It's a very old movie. It's a 1980s movie. And I'll tell you the storyline. And when I tell you the storyline, it's the most boring movie. It's actually a fun movie. It's about for lack of a better word, at that time they didn't call them PE guys, a PE guy, private equity guy, who does a hostile acquisition of a cable company in New England. You know those phone cables? So the movie plays out where the acquirer buys the company, and basically it's a contest between the CEO of the company and this hostile acquirer. So think of the acquirer saying he wants to maximize value, I want to increase the stock price. You know who played the acquirer? Anybody know? Danny DeVito. So I want you to visualize Danny DeVito. It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia remains one of my favorite shows, but there's Danny DeVito. That's corporate finance. You know who played the CEO of the phone company?
Gregory Peck.
Gregory Peck. You guys have never seen Gregory Peck? Distinguished gray hair. There's your corporate finance and anti-corporate finance. Basically, do you want to be Danny DeVito? Do you want to be Gregory Peck, right? But in this movie, the good part of it is it actually plays out. The climactic moment for the movie is an annual meeting. And Danny DeVito gets up and everybody in the meeting is the employees. They say, how dare you kill our company? It's been around 100 years. It's an amazing company. And he says, look, I am going to kill your company, but it's not me that's causing it. It's a fact that you make cables that fiber optics is doing it to you. I am the messenger here. But you know what? I know private equity is acquired all, and private equity walks very close to that line. There are things that private equity does, especially in healthcare, that I think are almost unconscionable. But for the most part, if you look at what private equity does, it essentially comes into businesses where what somebody is doing doesn't make sense anymore. And they say, you know what? Maybe you should stop doing it. It's easy to blame the messenger. So if you're equating maximizing stock price with being a bad person, go ahead. But I think in a sense, there are a lot of bad people who destroy their companies and lower stock prices as well. Now, goodness and badness is a distribution you're going to find pretty much all kinds of companies. So these are the facile ways you kind of push it. So I'm going to start with what I call the utopian world from which corporate finance is born. When did utopia exist? What is utopia? Oh, it never existed. So already I'm giving you a precursor that what I'm going to describe in this world is going to be completely unrealistic, but hang in there. In the utopian world in which corporate finance is born, here's the way the world works. First, stockholders in this world, in publicly traded companies, have complete power over managers. I want you to think of a company you own shares in and think of how much power you have. And already you can see utopia moving further and further away from you. You own those Meta shares, complete power over Meta. Are you kidding me? But let's stay in this utopian world. How do they exercise that power? Through the annual meeting and through the board of directors. Remember, in theory, the board of directors works for the shareholders. Its job is to oversee management to make sure they're doing their fiduciary duty. And what do managers do? They're so terrified of shareholders. They go out and do the right thing, increase value for shareholders. In this world, lenders lend money to a firm and they write no protections. And for whatever reason, the company doesn't take advantage of all of those loopholes. Why? Because it has come back to the borrow money. It's a reputation effect. And I can tell you stories about how you can get away with it. But in this world, that always happens. You lend money, you don't protect yourself, you never get ripped off. This world, when as a company something happens to you, you go out to financial markets and you tell them what happened honestly and on time. Now we're really approaching the far edges of utopia, right? So what universe, in the world that I just described, here's what would happen. And I'll take a personal example. I've been an Apple user since 1981. And I'd wait a long time for an Apple laptop to arrive. It didn't come till the early 90s. It's called the PowerBook. It was just loosely a laptop. It weighed like 15 pounds and got really hot on your lap. So you'd get burns on your. But and we were happy as Apple users. It did have one small issue. It sometimes caught fire. This is not exactly a feature you go looking for in a laptop, right? Spontaneous combustion, not there, not there, not there. It'll make your next presentation incredibly memorable, but your next plane trip could be a disaster. Turned out the batteries that Apple was using were overheating and just blowing up. Now, in the world that I described, what would Apple do? It would run out of markets right away and say, guys, our laptops are hot. Just leave it at that. Technically, you're not lying. And that's something to remember about companies. You don't actually have to lie. You just have, I told you, I have 4 kids, they don't actually lie to me, but they sometimes hold back the truth. We all do it. But the world that never happened. We all tell the truth to each other. We're like, blurt out everything. And in return, what do markets do? They're cool and rational about what you just told them. I'll describe a trading room in this world. It'll be full of intellectual people. Have any of you been in a trading room? Full of intellectual people, right? Who have long conversations about the long term. Not really. But in this world, that's what happens. And finally, in this world, there are no social costs. What's a social cost? Anybody want to tell me that? Or in economics, we call these externalities, right? What is it? Nobody wants to try? Go ahead. on the rest of society, right? But we have to finish the third. Costs that are created for society that you can't generally trace back to the company easily. Right? Because if you can trace it back, there are ways to make the company pay. But generally, social costs are costs that are, no. And already you're saying, but only bad companies create social costs. Not everybody does. That hot dog stand outside, I briefly considered using that as my sixth business. It's created a social cost for me. It's been around 38 years. I know the guy really well, but I often walk down that sidewalk, and he's cost me like 15 steps every day for the last. You're saying this is so petty. Hey, think of the thousands of people who walk down, multiply by 15 steps. It's right in the middle of the sidewalk. Sometimes you slip on ice because you can't get. That's a social cost. Companies, when they run businesses, create costs for society. And we'll talk about why that's an issue, but in the utopian world, there are no social costs. Why am I doing this? Because in economics, when you have a problem you can't deal with, what do? You assume it away. You put yourself on an island, let's live it. Because what we're trying to do is make the world safe for maximizing stock price. In what sense? I want you to maximize stock prices the right way. What's the right way? You got to go out and pick good investments, make good products. That's so much work. Because you can go increase stock prices by stealing from your bondholders, by ripping off your customers, by not paying taxes that you should be paying. In this world, none of that stuff happens. But let's start with that world, because in a sense, it's going to give us that standard that we can compare. So in the utopian world, what do companies do? They maximize stock price. Because markets are efficient. When you maximize stock price, what do? You maximize stockholder wealth. So we got rid of that problem. Lenders are not ripped off. So basically, when I maximize stockholder wealth, it's not coming from ripping off my lenders. This world is a utopian world. Employees are paid a reasonable wage because you want them to work. You don't exploit them. Same thing with customers. You basically provide them the product you would, you get a reasonable price, you pay your fair share of taxes, you follow the rules and the regulations. And it's like a Disney movie. Everybody lives happily ever after. I don't know about you, but I don't live in this world. Every one of those assumptions I listed is patently unrealistic. So let's go to the real world and all hell is going to break loose. Let's start with the first linkage. What did I say? Stockholders have complete power over managers. Well, not really. And as you go outside the US, it gets worse. Japanese companies, Indian family group companies. And we'll talk about the two mechanisms, annual meetings and boards of directors, and why they don't work. And if shareholders have little power over managers, what do? They put their interests often ahead of shareholder interests. It's human nature. It's not because they're bad people. So why do you have an apartment on Fifth Avenue if you're the CEO of a company? You can give me all kinds of, this is for convenience, but you don't need a penthouse apartment on Fifth. You could get a hotel room in Midtown Manhattan, a good room too. Managerial interests get ahead. We'll look at examples of that. Lenders lend money to a firm and you don't protect it, so what's going to happen? You're going to get ripped off. It's not a question of whether, it's a question of when. Do companies sometimes lie to financial markets? Absolutely. But all too often, it's not that they lie, but that they try to delay bad news, manage the flow. And in return, markets are not angelic either, right? That cool, rational market is not exactly the trading room. What do you think happened on Monday morning? Do you think people over the weekend worked through the expected revenue growth for NVIDIA over the next 20 years and what DeepSeek would do to their margins? I think so. They came in and they sold. And finally, do companies create social costs? Yeah, absolutely. Do they sometimes create social benefits? That too. It's a messy world. And I'd like to take each of these linkages and take a deeper look. Let's start with the first linkage. In theory, shareholders have complete power over managers. How do they get there? Through the annual meeting of the board of directors. Let's start with, in practice, why those two mechanisms don't work. Let's start with the annual meeting. How many of you are shareholders in publicly traded companies? Okay, so quite a few. The rest of you had to sell your shares to pay the tuition, I would guess. I understand, right? How many of you have been to an annual meeting? Just one couple of people, that's good. I own shares in 40 companies. I've never been to an annual meeting, and I don't intend to start. I'll give you an example. I own shares in Coca-Cola. I've never been to an annual meeting because think through the process of what this involves. I first have to fly to Atlanta. It's an extraordinarily overpriced flight from New York, and even more so from San Diego. Let's say it's $600. I have to stay in that peach whatever section of Atlanta. This is a really depressing part of Atlanta where everybody seems to leave at 7 p.m. That'll cost me another $600. Add up the meals and the other stuff, $1,500 round trip. There goes my profit for the year, right? For most of us, it makes no sense to go to an annual meeting, but in theory, I can be there without actually being there. I'm not being mysterious, but as shareholders in a company, what do you usually get the right to do? You get a proxy. In the old days, it actually used to be a physical document you got in the mail. I remember getting that document. And you know what I did with that document? If I was feeling environmentally conscious, it went into recycling. If not, it went into trash. I had zero interest in filling out that proxy because most of the time I was asked to vote for people I'd never heard of or in things that had come up, which I didn't really care about. You know that I'm not alone, that 60% of proxies never get returned. But those are 1,000 shares in Coca-Cola, right? So when I threw it in the trash or recycling, what happened to the 1,000 votes? Where does it go? Where do they go? In much of the world, when proxies don't get voted, those votes go to incumbent managers. See what this process does, right? It's like having an election where the incumbent gets the votes of anybody who doesn't show up to vote. No US incumbent would ever get defeated, right? Because I think, what, 49% of people show up to vote? You start with 51%. You don't even have to vote for yourself. You've already won. It's a process tilted towards incumbents, which is one reason when you look at votes at annual meetings, it's very, very difficult. Not impossible. Talk about what might tip it over the edge to get to 25. When you see a 30% no vote against management at an annual meeting, that must mean that pretty much everybody who voted against management, but they started with 70%. I just remember when JP Morgan had this issue with Jamie Dimon. There was a proposal to put him back as the chair of the board again, because he'd done the right corporate governance thing and stopped being chair of the board, but he wanted to be chair of the board. Why? Because he's a bit of a megalomaniac. So the proposition, shareholders said, that's not right. The corporate governance thing, you did the right thing. So it comes up for a vote, and there's a 36% no vote and 64. And so the way the Wall Street Journal article on it reported was Jamie Dimon wins because 64% of the people voted for him. The shareholders voted for him. Not really. It's very difficult to get a no vote at an annual meeting, right? So it's not just small stock, but he's saying, what about the big institutional investors? Well, what about them? For the most part, you know what they do? They vote with incumbent managers. It's the easy path. And I don't blame them. I had somebody from the Vanguard index funds last week in an executive MBA class that I taught at Stern. If you're in Vanguard, how the heck are you going to show up at shareholder meetings that every company owns shares in and actually throw your weight around? First, it's not your money to throw the weight around with. And second, that's a lot of companies. Most institutional investors vote with their feet, which means if they don't like a company, guess what they do? They sell their shares and move on. They don't stand and fight. So if you look at an annual meeting, not only do you individual investors not show up, institutional investors, essentially vote with. It's very difficult to get something going against incumbent management. So if you don't like the way a company is managed and you're saying, I'm going to go do something at the annual meeting, all the more power to you. But you're embarking on a mission that is going to be really, really, really difficult to win. We'll talk about what might tilt the scales. But most annual meetings, and this gets even worse outside the US. In Japan, for a long time, incumbent managers used to hire yakuzas. Yakuzas are these gang members. They'd show up at annual meetings. And this actually happened because there was an activist investor in the US who showed up at a Japanese company and he wanted to question management. Every time he'd stand up to ask a question, this group of people in the back would get up and yell as loud as they could, the yakuzas, and you would never get the question through. In Europe, it's a different kind of problem. I remember this company called Tattingers. Have you heard of it? It's a French company. Makes very expensive stuff that most of us can live without. It's a luxury. It used to be a family-owned company, but it's now a publicly traded company. And the CEO of the company is Claudia Tattinger. You're saying that's a coincidence. She has the same last name. It is the family. And this was an annual meeting. This activist investor from the US called Asher Edelman gets up. And he asked a question, which I thought was a very reasonable question. He said, I noticed that Tattinger's, the company, owns a lot of chateaus. Who lives in these chateaus? She refused to answer the question. After the meeting, she had a press conference. She said, no, I am hurt that such a rude question would be asked of me. I now understand why they're the guillotine. The French Revolution. This is about as separated from what you should be asking as a CEO of a publicly traded company. And for the longest time, European annual meetings were exquisitely well-managed and well-behaved affairs. Because you didn't ask those rude questions. That's for the riffraff. Annual meetings are tough to break through for lots of different reasons. And you can see why. Just think, what about the board of directors? What about the board of directors? I know many of you might have worked at publicly traded companies. I want you to go back and look at the annual report for the company you worked at and look at the board of directors for your company. Then ask yourself the question, who comes up with these names? Did they pull them out of a phone book? Is there even such a thing as a phone book? In most companies for a long time, you know who came up with the names, right? The CEO did. I remember when John Mack became CEO of Morgan Stanley, the first 3 people that he pulled for the board were members of his country club. And I entirely understood what was going on. Let's say you're the CEO of a company, you want to put together a board of directors. I let you pick the names. You have 2 choices. You can pick the 12 most informed, intelligent people who ask you tough questions and keep you on your toes. That's choice 1. The other is you can pick the 12 most sloshed people at a bar and put them on your board. Which one's going to make your life easier? You have enough martinis flowing, you'll never get asked a question. That China investment, you lost $6 billion, not a problem. Bring me another martini. Boards of directors are often composed of people that the CEO picks. I know there's a nominating committee now, but if you're operating under the delusion that that nominating committee doesn't check with the CEO before they put a name on, then you're not hanging out with the people who tend to be directors at companies. So if you look at, I don't know why the clickers work. In practice, what happens? CEOs pick directors. Second, you're saying, but these directors must be shareholders in the company, right? Technically, they often are, but you know how they get the shares? The company often gives them the shares. They don't even make them buy them. And you buy 2,000 shares in NVIDIA, trust me, you're not thinking like a shareholder, you're thinking like a board member. And it's astonishing how many companies have other company CEOs on their board. I've never understood how somebody has the time to be the CEO of a company and sit on the board of another company. The bottom line is, you'd love to believe that boards of directors act as a check on management, but they don't. There are a couple of reasons. One is, I think, you've seen Robert Rules of Order. I think this guy was some kind of a person who had some psychological issues. He wanted to mete out punishment. It's a way of keeping order. It's a very, very, if you want to run a meeting, you want to make sure that you control the meeting. You bring out Robert's Rules of Order. That's out of order. The requirement of staying with order. The second is, if you're in a room with 11 other people you feel this urge to be a team player. So if you have a question, you sometimes hold back because that might not be a nice thing to ask. I know in the last 30 years, we paid lip service to corporate governance. It started with the scandals of the late 90s. Lip service in what sense? You know, there's this entire law called Sarbanes-Oxley that was written to make boards more independent. Keyword is independent. And it actually accomplished that objective. And you can't have insiders on the board. You can't have your nephew, your niece. You can have loopholes to get them there, but generally, it pushed independence. And the assumption was if you have an independent board, it will be an effective board. And the two are very different requirements, right? Independence just means you don't have disconnections, conflicts of interest. Effective means you're willing to push back. So 30 years after Sarbanes, it's actually 23 years since Sarbanes-Oxley, guess what? Corporate governance doesn't seem to have changed, even though you got this immense law that was passed. You're saying why? I think that there is a psychological issue. You're in a room, you're a director at Goldman Sachs. The CEO of Goldman Sachs gets up and says, this is what we're doing as Goldman Sachs. Psychologically, you feel the need to say, that guy is the authority figure, that person is the authority figure. He or she must know more about the company than I do. I'm not going to push back here. You know what? If you really want to make boards more effective, maybe we need to learn from the Catholic Church. I mean, let's give it credit. It's been around 2,000 years. It's figured out a way to survive and prosper. Because the Catholic Church had a problem in the I think the 14th or the 15th century. Too many people were becoming saints. If you follow the process for becoming a saint in the Catholic Church, somebody comes up with a name, then a whole group of people come up with all these miracles, and they go to Rome and they present the evidence. And then Rome says, yes, no. And it turned out that too many people were becoming saints because there was this group pushing for a saint, but there was nobody who had an incentive on the other side to mount an argument against sainthood. So too many people were going through. So the Catholic Church created a position, and I love the name of the position, called the devil's advocate. The devil's advocate's job was to push back against the sainthood people. So it's a miracle. No, not a miracle. The water would have come out of the ground anyway. Brought this person back to life. No, the person was just sleeping, so woke him up. I proposed this a couple of years ago in a corporate governance session. Nobody took it on. I said, what we need is the equivalent of a devil's advocate in the board. The CEO, you have a counter CEO. The CEO brings out bankers who say, this deal is a good one. The counter CEO is given the resources to hire his bankers and say, that deal is a bad one. I know this will bring the process to a grinding halt, but independent boards are not necessarily effective boards. So I'm going to show you, as the end of the class, the worst board I've ever seen at a large publicly traded company in history. I'll start the process there, complete the condemnation next session. This was the board created at Disney in 1997. Anybody remember who the CEO of Disney was in 1997? A guy called Michael Eisner, guy with an ego so large that he could be in a big office by himself and it felt crowded. He was an imperial CEO. You know what an imperial CEO is? Like Caesar, right? Make decisions, affirmation follows. And this was the board he put together. So let's start with Michael Eisner. He's on the board, which is not unusual, CEO, but he's also the chair of the board. I've never understood this. You chair a board that's supposed to oversee you and tell you whether, that sounds like there's a conflict of interest. But that used to be common. In 1997, that was standard across US companies. But let's go through some of the other names. There was Ms. Rebecca Bowers. You're saying, who the heck is she? It's a principal of an elementary school in LA. You're saying, this is good. Disney is a kid-oriented company. She's around kids all day. This might have been pure coincidence, but she happened to be the head of the elementary school that Michael Eisner's kids went to. Complete coincidence. Set that to the side, right? Let's keep going down. There is Father Leo O'Donovan. Any Georgetown, right? This is good to have a religious influence on this heathen board, right? Again, it might be pure coincidence, Michael Eisner's son had gone to Georgetown. He sat on the Georgetown's board and he made a substantial contribution to the Georgetown Endowment Fund. Set that aside, pure coincidence again. Okay. Here's my favorite one, Irwin E. Russell, attorney at law. You say, what do you have against lawyers? A lot, but this is not the forum for me to discuss that. He was Michael Eisner's personal attorney. How the heck do you get away with this? I'm going to put my lawyer on the board and he's going to be independent. It's nice to have your lawyer in the room all the time. Saying, don't answer that question, Mike. Take the fifth on that one, Mike. But don't tell me he's going to be an independent person. And to top it all off, Sidney Poitier, great actor, right? He actually made the list of top 10 directors in 97, but it's the wrong list of directors who missed the most meetings. So guess who's coming to dinner is guess who's not coming to the meeting today. And he chaired the compensation committee. This is what a rubber stamp board looks like. You know what a rubber stamp board does? Basically, the CEO says, this is what I want to do, rubber stamp. I want to acquire a company, rubber stamp. I want to buy ABC, rubber stamp. And it's more common than you realize. So here's my first task for you, and this is why I want you to pick a company early. Pick a company, and for the moment, you might not have picked the final company. Pick any company you're interested in, take a look at the board and ask yourself, how effective? Don't get distracted by how diverse the board is, how independent the board is. All those are diversions. How effective is this board going to be? Because they have a singular task, act as a check and manager. So on Monday, we will continue with this discussion of corporate governance, but by then I hope you're in a group and I hope you picked a company. So start that process this weekend.